There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend beside you on a couch. You don't recognize them as watershed events at the time. There is no thunderclap, no orchestral score swelling in the background. There is only the moment itself, small and unassuming. And then there is the echoing silence of the everything after, the landscape of your entire world subtly, irrevocably rearranged. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a dramatic confrontation. It was a whisper in the dark, a quiet instruction that felt less like a command and more like a plea, a laying down of arms after a war I hadn't even realized we were fighting. It was the scent of his laundry detergent and the faint, warm smell of his skin, and the three simple words that dismantled every fortress I had ever built around my own heart. It was his voice, low and rough with an emotion I couldn't name, saying, "Close your eyes and trust me." And then, before I could draw a breath, before my mind could catch up to the tectonic shift happening in the space of a few inches, his lips were on my neck. Not a kiss of passion, not a kiss of desire as I had understood it, but something far more terrifying and far more profound. It was a kiss of surrender. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that was both a relief and a terror, that nothing would ever be ordinary again. I had known Liam for 7 years, which felt like a lifetime and no time at all. We met in a sophomore-level photography class, a general education credit he was taking to escape the rigid logic of his computer science curriculum, and I was taking because it was the first stepping stone toward my actual major. He was loud, in a way that wasn't obnoxious but simply present. He filled whatever space he was in, his laughter echoing a little too long, his gestures broad and emphatic. He was sunlight and open fields, while I had always been more comfortable in the shade, in the quiet observation of the darkroom. I was a photographer of still things, architecture, landscapes, the way light fell across an empty room. He became the first moving thing I ever truly wanted to capture. He sat next to me on the first day, dropping his bag with a thud and offering a wide, uncomplicated grin. "Hey, I'm Liam. I have no idea what I'm doing here." I remember just nodding, my own name getting caught somewhere in my throat. I was intimidated by his ease, the way he navigated the world as if it were built for him. My own existence felt more like a negotiation, a constant process of finding the right angles, of making myself smaller to fit. But he didn't seem to notice my quietness as a barrier. He treated it like a space, and he simply, comfortably, began to fill it. He'd lean over to ask what an f-stop was, his arm brushing mine, sending a jolt through my system that I dismissed as static electricity. He'd compliment a print of mine, a stark black-and-white shot of a rain-slicked alleyway, and his praise felt warmer than the sun. Our friendship wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow development, like a photograph emerging in a chemical bath. It started with him borrowing my notes, then evolved into studying together in the library, his restless energy a strange but welcome counterpoint to my focused silence. He'd tap his pen, jiggle his leg, and I'd find it grounding. He was a tether to the vibrant, kinetic world outside my own head. Soon, library sessions bled into late-night diners, then weekends spent exploring the city, me with my camera, him with his endless curiosity. He'd point out things for me to shoot, the way a vine crawled up a brick wall, the reflection of a skyscraper in a puddle, and he never seemed to mind my long silences as I framed a shot. He learned to read my quiet. He understood that my lack of words wasn't a lack of feeling. By the time we graduated, our friendship was the most stable structure in my life. It was a home I had built without realizing it. We got an apartment together with a third roommate, a logical step that felt monumental to me. Living with him meant he was a constant, a fixed point in my daily orbit. It meant seeing him first thing in the morning, hair a mess, mumbling about coffee. It meant the sound of his keyboard clacking away late into the night as he worked on some coding project. It meant his life was interwoven with mine in 1,000 mundane, beautiful ways. And it was in the quiet domesticity of that first year that I had to finally confront the truth I had been carefully cropping out of the frame. I was in love with him. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow dawning awareness, like the gradual brightening of a sunrise. It was in the way my stomach would flip when he'd laugh at one of my dry, under-my-breath jokes. It was in the ache I felt when he'd talk about a date, his eyes lit with an excitement that had nothing to do with me. It was in the collection of photographs I kept on a hidden hard drive, dozens of candid shots of him. Liam reading on the couch, the afternoon light catching the gold in his hair. Liam laughing with his head thrown back, a moment of pure, unself-conscious joy. Liam asleep on the sofa, his face softened, all the restless energy finally stilled. I told myself it was practice, an exercise in portraiture. But I knew the truth. I was an archivist of a love I could never declare. And, of course, there was Sarah. She had been a constant in his life almost as long as I had. They were the couple everyone expected to get married. She was lovely, smart, funny, and she clearly adored him. I liked her genuinely. But I was also jealous of her in a way that felt acidic and shameful. I was jealous of the casual way she could touch his arm, the way she was the one he called late at night, the way her name was the one on his lips when he talked about the future. Her existence was the firm, uncrossable boundary line. It was the wall against which my own feelings were a futile, silent protest. So I buried it. I built a fortress of platonic friendship, reinforced with shared jokes and movie nights, and the unspoken understanding that this was all we would ever be. It was a safe, if lonely, place to live. I became the best friend, the reliable one, the quiet observer, the keeper of his secrets, all except the one I held most closely. For years, this was our equilibrium. It was a delicate, carefully maintained balance, and the most terrifying thing I could imagine was doing anything that might cause it to shatter. I valued his friendship more than I trusted my own heart. I would rather have him in my life as a friend than not at all. It was a simple, painful calculation I made every single day. The shift began with a phone call on a rainy October evening. The kind of relentless, soul-dampening rain that makes the world feel gray and small. I was in my darkroom, the faint, sharp smell of fixer in the air, watching a print of a solitary lighthouse slowly materialize under the dim red safe light. My phone, left on the counter, buzzed insistently, its vibration a harsh intrusion into the quiet alchemy of the room. I almost ignored it. I was in a delicate phase, a moment of becoming. But it buzzed again, and a familiar, specific dread coiled in my gut. It was Liam. I wiped my hands and answered, the sudden brightness of the screen making me squint. "Hey," I said, my voice quiet. The silence on the other end was heavy, waterlogged. I could hear the rain drumming against a window pane wherever he was, and something else, a choked, ragged sound that was almost a sob. "Alex," he said, and his voice was so broken, so stripped of its usual buoyant energy, that it felt like a physical blow. Can I come over?" He was already on his way. He didn't live with me anymore. He and Sarah had gotten a place together across town a year prior, another logical step that had felt like a small, private amputation to me. "Of course," I said immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "It's over," he whispered, and the words were swallowed by another one of those awful, hitching breaths. It's over." I didn't need to ask what it was. The central pillar of his life, the future he had been so certain of, had just collapsed. I stood there in the sudden, stark silence after he hung up, the half-developed image of the lonely lighthouse floating in its chemical bath, a metaphor so on the nose it was almost cruel. My first, overwhelming emotion was a wave of pure, unadulterated sympathy. I thought of his face when he talked about Sarah, the easy certainty in his smile. To see that shattered, it was unthinkable. But beneath that wave, in the deep, quiet undertow, was something else. A flicker of something ugly and selfish and hopeful that I immediately, violently, tried to drown. It was the guiltiest I had ever felt in my life. When he arrived 20 minutes later, he looked like a ghost. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead, and his jacket was soaked through, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes, usually so bright and alive, were hollowed out, lost. He just stood on my welcome mat, dripping onto the floor, looking at me as if he wasn't sure what to do next. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside, opened the door wider, and he stumbled in, collapsing onto my sofa as if his strings had been cut. He dropped his head into his hands, and his shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. I had never seen him cry before. Not like this. I had seen him tear up at a sad movie, seen his eyes get misty at a friend's wedding, But this was different. This was the complete unraveling of a person. I felt useless, an intruder in a grief so profound. I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the kitchen, made him a cup of tea he wouldn't drink, and grabbed the old quilt off the back of my armchair. I walked back to the sofa and gently, hesitantly, draped it over his trembling shoulders. He didn't look up, but he reached out a hand, fumbling for mine. His fingers were ice cold. He just held on, his grip crushingly tight, as if I were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. He stayed the night, and the next. The first few days were a blur of him sleeping on my couch, a crumpled, silent figure buried under the quilt. He barely ate. He didn't talk about what happened, not in detail. He just existed in a state of suspended animation, and my role was simply to be there, to be a quiet, constant presence. I'd work on my photos, the clicks of my keyboard a soft, steady rhythm in the otherwise silent apartment. I'd leave food out for him. I'd make sure the tea was always hot. I was his keeper, his silent guardian. It was a strange, painful intimacy. He was more vulnerable with me than he had ever been, but he was also a million miles away, lost in the ruins of his own life. I told myself my role was simple, to be a friend, to be the harbor in his storm, and I could not, think of anything beyond that. The flicker of hope I'd felt was a betrayal, and I buried it under layers of concern and careful, platonic affection. That first week, he slept exclusively on the couch. My apartment wasn't large, just a simple one-bedroom, and the living room became his domain. I'd go to my own room at night, close the door, and lie in the dark, listening. I could hear every shift of his weight on the cushions, every sigh, every time his breathing would hitch in his sleep. It felt like I was standing guard. The closed door between us was a physical manifestation of the boundary I was so desperate to maintain. I was on one side, in the familiar quiet of my own life, and he was on the other, in a new and terrible wilderness. My job was to stay on my side, to be the lighthouse, not the tide. But the sound of his quiet suffering was a constant pull, eroding the shoreline of my resolve. The ritual began about a week into his stay. It was late, well after midnight. I had finished some editing and came out of my room to get a glass of water. The only light was the cold, blue glow of the television, casting long shadows across the room. He was sitting up on the couch, staring blankly at the screen, a silent movie playing out before him. He hadn't turned the volume up. "Can't sleep?" I asked, my voice a whisper in the quiet space. He shook his head, not looking at me. Every time I closed my eyes, I just see her. Leaving his voice was flat, exhausted. "It's too quiet in here. I can stay up for a bit," I offered, the words leaving my mouth before I could think them through. "We can watch something. Properly." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were so full of a raw, desperate gratitude that it stole my breath. "Yeah," he asked, his voice small. "Would you mind?" I didn't mind. I sat on the far end of the couch, keeping a careful, respectable distance between us, and we watched some mindless action movie from the 90s. The dialogue was terrible, the explosions were loud, and it was perfect. It was noise. It was a distraction. About halfway through, he shifted, his body language communicating a deep, cellular restlessness. He lay down, stretching his long frame out on the couch, his head now resting on the armrest at the far end. But he was still restless, still tense. After a few more minutes of his fidgeting, he spoke, his voice muffled by the cushions. "Alex, yeah, this is gonna sound weird. But can you? I don't know. Can you just sit closer?" My heart did a slow, painful lurch. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming. Danger. Boundary line. Do not cross. But the exhaustion in his voice, the simple, desperate need, it overrode everything. I slid across the cushion, the friction of the fabric loud in the tense silence. I stopped about a foot away from him. It wasn't enough. He shifted again, rolling onto his side to face the back of the couch, away from me. "My head's killing me on this armrest," he mumbled. "Is your lap? Would that be okay?" Plausible deniability. It was a masterstroke of it. It wasn't about intimacy. It was about comfort. It was about a poorly designed sofa. My mind was a frantic cacophony of pros and cons, of fear and a deep, resonant longing. My body, however, acted on its own. I just nodded, a useless gesture in the dark, and patted my thigh. He took it as the invitation it was. He slowly, carefully, shifted again, lifting his head and gently lowering it onto my lap. The world stopped. My entire universe contracted to the weight of his head on my legs, the warmth of him seeping through the denim of my jeans. I could feel the silkiness of his hair against my hand, which was now resting, awkwardly, on the cushion beside his face. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of such profound relief that it vibrated through my whole body. And then he was still. For the first time in days, the restless energy was gone. He had found his anchor. And I, his anchor, was completely, utterly adrift. I sat there, rigid, my own breathing shallow, for the rest of the movie and for a long time after. I listened as his breath deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. I was terrified to move, terrified to breathe, terrified that this fragile, impossible piece would shatter if I so much as shifted my weight. This was the first night of the ritual. The first time the unspoken rules were not just bent, but broken. It became our new normal. Every night, we would migrate to the couch. We stopped pretending it was about watching a movie. It became about the silence and the proximity. He would lie down, and without a word, rest his head in my lap. Sometimes I would tentatively, my fingers trembling, run my hand through his hair. The first time I did it, he made a small, contented sound in his sleep, and my heart felt like it was going to burst. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief. This couldn't be real. This was a dream I was having, a fragile bubble of intimacy that would pop the moment the sun came up. But it didn't. Morning would come, and he would stir, lifting his head from my lap with a mumbled, thanks. He'd be quiet, a little distant, as if the night had been a dream for him, too. He'd go about his day, making calls, looking for a new apartment, trying to piece his life back together, and I would go about mine. But the night would always fall again, and with it, the unspoken agreement. We would return to the couch, to our silent arrangement. It was a haven, and it was a torture. I had him closer than ever before, but the distance between what this was for him, comfort, a temporary solace, and what it was for me, everything, felt like a chasm. I became a student of his smallest gestures. I was a cartographer of his grief, mapping its terrain through the tension in his shoulders, the way he'd press his face into my leg as if trying to hide from the world. I learned the difference between his exhausted sleep and his troubled sleep. I learned the sound of his breathing when he was having a nightmare. On those nights, I would rest my hand on his back, a solid, steady pressure, and whisper his name until the tension left his body. He never mentioned it in the morning. I never knew if he was even aware of it. We were living in a strange duality. The chaste, careful friendship of the daytime, and the profound, ambiguous intimacy of the night. The escalation happened on a Saturday, about 3 weeks in. We had spent the day in a comfortable silence, me editing photos at my desk, him reading on the armchair. The forced cheerfulness he'd been attempting for a few days had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, weary sadness. That night, when we settled onto the couch, something was different. He was even more restless than usual, the familiar position not bringing him the usual peace. After an hour of his tossing and turning, he sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair. "I can't," he said, his voice raw with frustration. "I can't get comfortable. This couch is destroying my back." He looked at me, his eyes shadowed in the dim light. "Alex, I know this is a huge ask, but could I just sleep in your bed? I can take the floor. I just need to be not here." The floor. It was another piece of brilliant plausible deniability. He wasn't asking to sleep with me. He was just asking to be in the same room. A room that wasn't haunted by the blue ghost of the television and the memory of his life falling apart. My bedroom was my sanctuary. It was the one place that was still completely mine. To let him in felt like a final surrender. "You're not sleeping on the floor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's a queen-sized bed. It's big enough." The relief that washed over his face was so potent, it was almost painful to see. "Are you sure?" I wasn't sure of anything. I was navigating a minefield in the dark. But I nodded. "I'm sure." That night was the most exquisite torture of my life. I gave him a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants to sleep in, my clothes on his body, a new and devastating form of intimacy. We got into the bed from opposite sides, the space between us a vast, charged territory. We lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, the silence in the room a living thing. Then, we both rolled onto our sides, facing away from each other, our backs a few inches apart. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gap. I focused on the sound of his breathing, trying to match mine to it, trying to find some semblance of calm. It was impossible. My entire being was aware of him. The scent of my soap on his skin, the slight dip his weight made in the mattress. I lay there for hours, rigid and sleepless, listening to him finally fall into a deep and peaceful sleep. The couch ritual was officially replaced by the bedroom ritual. He never mentioned the floor again. Every night, he would retreat to my room, and we would perform the same careful choreography. We would get into bed, lie on our backs, and then turn away from each other. It was an established pattern, a new set of unspoken rules. We don't touch. We don't acknowledge the strangeness of this. We pretend this is normal for two friends. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, one of us would shift, and a hand would brush a back, or a foot would touch a leg. These accidental touches were like lightning strikes in the dark, brief and electric, followed by an immediate, careful retreat. My nights became a landscape of intense hyper-awareness, a desperate cataloging of every sound, every movement, every shift in the air between us. The door to my room, once a barrier, was now a frame for this impossible tableau. It was a door he had walked through, but the room itself was still full of invisible walls. I was a photographer in a darkroom again, watching an image of us develop, terrified of what the final picture would reveal. The night of the crossing felt different from the start. A cold front had moved in, and the wind howled outside my apartment window, rattling the glass in its frame. It was a wild, unsettled night, and the mood had seeped indoors. Liam had been quiet all day, withdrawn in a way that felt different from his usual grief-stricken silence. It felt more thoughtful, more internal. He had gotten a call earlier, an offer for a freelance coding project that would be a good step toward rebuilding his professional life. It was good news, but it didn't seem to lift his spirits. If anything, it seemed to make him more somber, as if the prospect of moving forward was just as daunting as being stuck. We didn't even pretend to do anything else that evening. After a sparse dinner we barely touched, he just looked at me and said, "Is it okay if we just go to bed?" The we was new. It wasn't I, it was we, a small shift in the tectonic plates beneath us. I just nodded. In my room, the familiar ritual began, but the energy was off. The air was thick with unspoken things. We got into bed, the sheets cold against our skin. We lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the wind filling the silence. I waited for him to turn away, for the familiar choreography to play out. But he didn't. He just kept staring at the ceiling, his breathing shallow. I could feel the tension radiating from him, a low hum of anxiety. I finally broke the silence. "Are you okay?" I whispered. He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what I'm doing, Alex," he said, his voice so low I could barely hear it over the wind. With anything, he turned his head on the pillow to look at me. In the dim light filtering in from the street, his eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "This project, it's in another city. I'd have to move." My blood ran cold. Move. The word was a stone dropping into the quiet pool of our strange, fragile world. It meant an end to this. An end to the nights on the couch, the shared bed, this whole impossible bubble we had been living in. I felt a selfish, desperate panic rise in my throat. I swallowed it down. My role was to be the supportive friend. That's great, Liam," I managed to say, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. "It's a good opportunity." "Is it?" he asked, and his gaze was so intense it felt like he was looking straight through my carefully constructed facade. "It just feels like running away. And I don't know what I'd be running from anymore. Or what I'd be running to." He paused, then added, so quietly it was almost lost, "I don't want to go." He held my gaze for another long moment, and then he rolled onto his side, facing me. This was a deviation, a radical break from the established pattern. My heart started to pound, a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I was still on my back, frozen, a statue of feigned calm. He was only a few inches away now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. He lifted a hand, his fingers hesitating in the air between us before he gently, so gently, rested them on my chest, right over my heart. He must have felt its wild, panicked rhythm. "Your heart is beating really fast," he whispered, a statement of fact, not a question. I couldn't speak. I could only look at him, my mind a complete and utter blank. The entire world had shrunk to the space between us, to the weight of his hand on my chest, to the dark intensity of his eyes. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound, but in here, in this small, sacred space, it was utterly silent. He moved his hand from my chest, his fingers tracing a slow, feather-light path up my collarbone to the side of my neck. His thumb came to rest in the hollow of my throat, right over my pulse, which was hammering away like a drum. He watched his own thumb rise and fall with my frantic heartbeat. "There too," he murmured. A strange, sad little smile touched his lips. "What are you so afraid of, Alex?" "You, I thought. This. Losing you." But I said nothing. He leaned in closer, his forehead now almost touching mine. His eyes searched mine in the dark, and I saw a universe of confusion and fear and a desperate, burgeoning hope that mirrored my own. And then he said it, the words that would become the axis on which my life would turn. His voice was a low, rough whisper, full of a vulnerability I had never heard from him before. "Close your eyes and trust me." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. He was asking me to meet him in this terrifying, uncharted territory. He was asking me to leap with him. And in that moment, all the fear, all the carefully constructed walls, all the years of silent longing didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the trust in his voice. So I did. I closed my eyes. I felt him shift, the mattress dipping as he moved even closer. I felt the warmth of his body envelop me. I braced myself for a kiss on the lips, a final, definitive crossing of the line. But that's not what happened. I felt his breath, warm and soft, against the skin of my neck. And then his lips, a soft, firm pressure just below my ear. It wasn't a kiss of passion, it was a kiss of arrival. It was a quiet declaration. "I am here. This is real." He held it for a long, breathless moment, and I felt a single, hot tear escape my closed eye and trace a path down my temple. It was a tear of relief, of terror, of a joy so profound it was painful. He had found the one place on my body that felt the most vulnerable, the most undefended, and he hadn't attacked it. He had honored it. He had made it safe. When he finally pulled back, it was only by an inch. I opened my eyes. His face was right there, his expression one of awe and trepidation. He looked at my mouth, then back to my eyes, a silent question. This time, I was the one who acted. I closed the final, infinitesimal distance between us and pressed my lips to his. It was clumsy and soft and hesitant, a kiss full of questions, but he answered it, his mouth softening against mine, a quiet confirmation in the dark. The morning after was a study in silence, but a new kind of silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of our old friendship, nor the strained, grief-filled quiet of the past few weeks. This was a fragile, shimmering silence, stretched taut with the unspoken enormity of what had happened. I woke up first, which was unusual. The first thing I was aware of was the warmth. Liam was still asleep, but sometime during the night, the careful distance between us had collapsed entirely. He was wrapped around me, his arm draped possessively over my waist, his face buried in the space between my shoulder blades. His breathing was a slow, steady puff of warm air against my back. My own body was rigid, a statue of disbelief. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, replaying the night in my head. The whisper, the press of his lips on my neck, the soft, questioning kiss. It felt like a dream, and I was terrified that any movement would wake me up, would wake him up and shatter the illusion. But then he stirred, his arm tightening around me for a moment before he seemed to realize where he was. He went suddenly, completely still. I felt the exact moment his consciousness returned, the exact moment the memory of the night before flooded his mind. The warmth behind me receded as he slowly, carefully, withdrew his arm. He shifted, rolling onto his back. The space between us was now a cold, vast emptiness. I didn't dare turn around. I just lay there, my back to him, my heart sinking into a cold pit of dread. I heard him take a deep, shaky breath. Then, the sound of the sheets rustling as he sat up. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, a coward in my own bed. I heard him get up, the soft padding of his feet on the wooden floor. I heard him grab his clothes from the day before. I heard the quiet click of my bedroom door opening, and then the even quieter click of it closing, leaving me alone in the room. He was gone. He hadn't said a word. The silence he left behind was louder than any shouting match. It was a screaming void, filled with all my worst fears. It was a mistake. He regretted it. He was disgusted, or scared, or both. I had read everything wrong. I had taken his grief and his need for comfort and twisted it into something it wasn't. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I finally forced myself to get up an hour later. The apartment was unnervingly quiet. A single coffee mug, his, was in the sink. A note was on the counter, his familiar, messy scrawl looking alien and menacing. Went for a run. Need to clear my head. It was a flimsy excuse, a coward's retreat, and we both knew it. He didn't come back for hours. I spent the day in a state of agonizing limbo, pacing my small apartment, jumping at every sound from the hallway. I was a ghost in my own home, haunted by the memory of a tenderness that had evaporated with the morning light. The hope that had bloomed in the dark had been brutally uprooted, leaving behind nothing but churned up dirt and panic. When he finally returned in the late afternoon, he looked exhausted, older. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He moved around the apartment with a forced, casual air that was more painful than any argument. He made small talk about the weather, about the project he'd been offered. He was rebuilding the wall between us, brick by painful brick, right before my eyes. And I was letting him. I was too afraid to speak, too afraid of what he would say if I forced the issue. The quiet observer in me was back in full force, cataloging his every evasion, his every averted gaze, the way he kept a physical distance between us at all times. The couch, our former island of intimacy, was now a no man's land. This went on for 2 days. 2 days of excruciating politeness. 2 days of living with a stranger who looked just like my best friend. The nights were the worst. He retreated to the couch, insisting he didn't want to put me out anymore. The closed door of my bedroom was once again a barrier, but now it felt like a prison sentence. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear him, but the apartment was silent. The fragile intimacy we had built was gone, replaced by a chasm of regret and fear. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was killing me more surely than any confession could. The quiet observer had to die. I had to say something, or we would be lost to this suffocating pretense forever. I found him in the living room, staring at the same blank, blue television screen from all those weeks ago. He didn't look up when I came in. I stood there for a moment, my courage wavering. This was it. The point of no return. I could let it go, let him retreat, and we could try to piece together some broken version of our old friendship. Or I could risk everything, absolutely everything, for the truth. I walked over and turned off the television. The sudden plunge into near darkness made him flinch. He finally looked at me, his face a mask of weary apprehension. "Liam," I said, my voice shaking slightly but firm. "We can't do this." "Do what?" he asked, his voice low, defensive. He was already retreating. "This," I said, gesturing to the space between us, to the whole silent, miserable apartment. "This pretending. You're acting like I'm a stranger. You're hiding on the couch. You won't look at me. You have to talk to me. Please." He dropped his head into his hands, the same gesture of defeat from the night he first arrived, but this time it felt different. It wasn't grief. It was shame. "I can't, Alex," he mumbled into his palms. "I don't know what to say." "Try." I pushed, my voice softer now, pleading. I sat down on the coffee table in front of him, forcing him to acknowledge me. "Tell me it was a mistake. Tell me you were just confused and lonely. Tell me you regret it. Just tell me something. The silence is what I can't handle." He lifted his head, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "What if I don't know if it was a mistake?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "What if that's the problem? I've spent my whole life on a single track, Alex. I knew who I was. I knew what I wanted. And then Sarah left, and my whole world fell apart. And you were the only thing that made sense." He took a ragged breath, finally meeting my eyes. Those nights, sleeping here, it wasn't just about comfort. It was the only time I felt safe. The only time my head was quiet. And I didn't understand why. I told myself it was just because you're my best friend. But that night, in your bed, I looked at you, and I felt something I have never felt before in my entire life. It terrified me. It still terrifies me. His confession was a torrent, a flood of pent-up fear and confusion. Kissing you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in years. And that's what's scaring me. I don't know what this means. I don't know who I am if this is true. I'm so afraid of ruining this, Alex. Ruining us. You're the most important person in my life. I can't lose you. I listened, my own fears slowly dissolving, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He was just as lost as I was. And in his confession, I finally found my own courage. You think you're the only one who's scared? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Liam, I have been in love with you for years. The words were out. They were just hanging there in the air between us, stark and undeniable and terrifyingly real. His eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief and then a dawning, wondrous understanding. I have spent years hiding it, burying it, because I was so terrified of losing you. I built my whole life around the idea that being your friend was enough. So don't you dare talk to me about being afraid of ruining this. I've been living with that fear every single day. I reached out and took his hands, his fingers cold and trembling in mine. What you're feeling, what you're afraid of, maybe you could just not be afraid of it alone, I said. Maybe we can be terrified together. A single tear finally escaped and rolled down his cheek. He let out a choke sound that was half sob, half laugh. He squeezed my hands, his grip tight, anchoring. Okay, he whispered. Okay, Alex. Together. The conversation didn't magically solve everything. There was no sudden, cinematic fade to black. Instead, it was the beginning of something new and frighteningly fragile. It was an agreement to stop pretending, an agreement to be honest, even when the honesty was messy and confusing. The days that followed were a delicate dance of navigation. We talked more than we had in our entire friendship. Real talk, about his confusion, about my years of silence, about what we both wanted and what we were both afraid of. It was awkward and halting, full of long pauses and fumbled words, but it was real. The suffocating politeness was gone, replaced by a tentative, vulnerable honesty. The physical space between us began to shift as well. The first night after our talk, as we were getting ready for bed, he paused at the door to my room. The couch? He asked, his voice uncertain, a genuine question this time, not a retreat. I looked at him, at the fear and hope warring in his eyes, and I felt a surge of tenderness so strong it almost buckled my knees. The bed is big enough, I said softly, and I left the door open for him. That night, we didn't turn away from each other. We lay on our sides, facing one another, the few inches of space between us no longer a chasm, but a shared territory. Sometime in the deep quiet of the night, he reached out and took my hand. He just held it, his thumb stroking softly over my knuckles, and we fell asleep like that, our hands clasped in the dark. The ritual was reborn. It was no longer about pretext or plausible deniability. It was about choice. It was about consciously deciding to be close. The couch became a place where he could rest his head in my lap not because his back hurt, but because he wanted to be near me, and I could run my fingers through his hair not because he was asleep, but because I wanted to, and he would lean into my touch. The small, accidental gestures of the past became small, intentional acts of affection. A hand on the small of my back as we passed in the kitchen, his knee brushing against mine as we sat at the table. Each touch was a quiet reaffirmation, a sentence in a new language we were learning together. He took the project in the other city, but he negotiated to do most of it remotely. He wasn't running away. He was building a new life, and he was building it with the assumption that I would be in it. He started looking for a new apartment, and one afternoon, he came to me with his laptop, showing me a listing for a 2-bedroom place not far from mine. What do you think? He'd asked, trying to sound casual. It's got great light. You could use the second bedroom as a proper studio. The unspoken question hung in the air between us. What if we build a home together? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, at the man I had loved in silence for so long, who was now tentatively, bravely, offering me a future. I thought of the lonely lighthouse in my photograph, a symbol of my own self-imposed isolation. I had thought I was the lighthouse, a fixed point of safety for him. But I had been wrong. We were two ships, lost in our own private storms, who had finally, miraculously, found the same harbor. One morning, a few weeks later, I woke to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and he was there, propped up on one elbow, just watching me. The morning light was soft, and his face was relaxed, the deep lines of stress and grief that had been etched there for so long finally beginning to fade. He wasn't smiling exactly. It was something quieter, more profound. A look of peace, of rightness. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey." I whispered back, my voice thick with sleep. He leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't like the first kiss, which had been full of questions and fear. This was a kiss of simple, quiet certainty. It was a morning kiss, a domestic kiss, a kiss that said, "I am here. You are here. This is our life now." When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. The bedroom door was closed, not to keep anyone out, but to keep us in, together, in the safe, quiet world we had built. The invisible walls had dissolved. The charged territories had become shared ground. There are moments that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and then there is the beautiful, honest silence of the everything after. We never know which doors, when opened, will lead to the rooms we were always meant to live in. We can only stand on the threshold, heart pounding, and listen for the quiet whisper that tells us to trust, to step through. The journey from loneliness to togetherness isn't a single, heroic leap across a chasm. It is a slow, patient process of building a bridge, plank by plank, with shared vulnerability and tentative, hopeful touch. It is learning that the safest place in the world isn't a fortress, but an open hand. And as I lay there, in the quiet morning light, with his hand in mine, I understood that we had finally, after all this time, made it to the other side. We had begun to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.